The office air was heavy, silence breaking only by the ticking clock, when Sarah felt her chest tighten, as if her world was collapsing in real time. She had worked in shadows too long, dismissed and unheard, yet today her name had been called with venom. "You don't belong here," a manager barked, his words cutting deeper than she expected, the words echoing like shards of glass inside her head. She clenched her fists, her heart pounding like a drum as everyone's eyes turned toward her, their stares filled with judgment and whispers too loud to ignore. Her mind screamed to vanish, to dissolve into nothingness, but her soul refused to break. James, her colleague, leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers with something that felt like a warning. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, illuminating her face pale with fury and shame as the room spun with betrayal. The air was suffocating, sweat trickling down her neck, her breath ragged, as if the entire weight of her life had been laid bare in that single brutal moment. Sarah said, "Is this what I've become to you? Just a mistake waiting to happen?" Her words shook, but there was fire beneath them. She did not know yet, but this was the beginning of the choice that would change everything. The storm outside roared louder, drowning out the murmurs in the office, yet Sarah's pulse echoed louder than thunder. She had been quiet her whole life, too afraid of being judged, too conditioned to accept the whispers that she was never enough. Tonight, though, those voices merged into one cruel chorus, and she realized silence was no longer survival. It was surrender. James shifted in his chair, his sarcastic tone breaking the charged silence. "Yes, they finally noticed you exist." His words cut, but his eyes softened, pushing her toward truth rather than comfort. Sarah wanted to lash out, to crumble, but something in his challenge lit a spark she didn't expect. She forced her breath steady, telling herself, "If I say nothing now, I'll vanish forever." Her voice cracked yet firm. She said, "I'm tired of being invisible." For the first time, her words filled the room with more power than the storm outside. Her voice, fragile but fierce, startled even herself as the words lingered. The room seemed to shrink, every gaze heavy upon her, yet for the first time, she did not bow under their weight. James' smirk faded, replaced by something sharper, almost approving, though he said nothing. The manager scoffed, shaking his head, dismissing her like dust. But Sarah stood still, heartbeat hammering against her ribs as if threatening to break free. She thought of her childhood, of years spent fading into corners, hiding her brilliance so no one would judge her. She realized every silence she had swallowed had built this moment. "You can dismiss me," she whispered to herself, "but I won't dismiss me again." Her defiance was not loud, but it was undeniable, and though her hands shook, her eyes burned with a fire long denied. She felt both terrified and alive. Sarah's mind screamed, begging her to retreat, yet her spirit refused. James finally spoke, voice low and cutting. "If you're waiting for someone to hand you power, you'll die waiting." His bluntness stung, but it ignited something deep, a truth she could not ignore. Her chest tightened, breaths shallow, but her resolve deepened with every second. The storm outside rattled the glass, mirroring the storm in her soul. She had lived too long in silence, in shadows carved by fear and rejection. Sarah thought, "If I walk away now, I will never walk into myself again." She said, "Then I'll take it, even if I have to bleed for it." The words burned as they left her, carrying the weight of decades. For the first time, she didn't just sound alive, she felt alive. Silence spread through the office like smoke, suffocating yet charged. Sarah's declaration hung in the air, untouchable. For years she had hidden, hoping someone might see her worth, but tonight she realized she must seize it herself. James leaned back, lips curling into the faintest grin, as if daring her to prove it. The manager scoffed again, his disdainful glance retreating, unwilling to waste more energy on her. But Sarah no longer cared. For once, she wasn't living for their approval. She stood not as the overlooked worker or the fragile shadow of her past, but as a woman daring to choose herself. Her heart still quaked, but her voice steadied when she whispered, almost to herself, "This is the beginning." The storm outside roared its approval, thunder crashing like applause as her choice carved a crack into the silence of her world. The storm carried into the next morning, gray light spilling over the city as Sarah dragged herself into the office. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of last night's words clung to her shoulders. Colleagues whispered, some pretending to type while their eyes darted to her. The sting of being judged gnawed at her, yet beneath the fear, a strange current of strength began to rise. James leaned against her desk, his tone blunt. You made noise. Now they'll test if you can stand by it. His smirk hid something more. He wasn't mocking, he was warning. Sarah clenched her jaw, every muscle urging her to retreat. But she forced herself to stay rooted. She thought of all the times she had bowed her head in silence, and how that silence had cost her pieces of herself. Her voice, quiet but steady, finally broke the tension. Let them test me. I'm done being their shadow. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee and tension. Sarah sat at the long table, heart pounding as the manager outlined a project designed to break her resolve. You'll lead this, he said with a cruel finality. Laughter flickered across the faces of a few colleagues, disbelief echoing louder than words. Sarah's pulse thundered, fear clawing at her throat. James caught her eye, his expression sharp, almost daring her to retreat. Instead, she breathed deeply, remembering the storm, remembering her vow. Fine, she said, voice trembling but firm. I'll lead it. The silence that followed was suffocating, yet electric, as if no one had expected her to accept. The manager sneered, certain she would fail, but Sarah's spine straightened. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking. She was stepping forward, even if it meant walking straight into fire. Sarah spent the day buried under stacks of files, her screen glowing with deadlines designed to overwhelm. Her chest tightened with every task piled onto her shoulders, whispers of failure circling her mind. She thought of her family's quiet doubts, her neighbors' dismissive looks, and the countless moments she had been told she wasn't enough. The weight of history pressed down, urging her to collapse. James stopped by, tossing a file onto her desk. You're drowning because you're letting them see you drown, he said flatly. His words struck like iron, cruel but necessary. Sarah shut her eyes, inhaling slow and sharp, then whispered, no more drowning. Her fingers steadied on the keyboard, defiance sparking through her exhaustion. She wasn't sure how she'd endure, but she knew she had to fight, because fading again was no longer an option. By evening, the office emptied, leaving Sarah under the hum of the last fluorescent lights. Shadows stretched long across the floor as she rubbed her temples, fighting tears. She had carried others' expectations all her life, but now she carried their ridicule too. James' words rang in her ears, cruel but cutting truth. Stop waiting, he had said. She stared at the mountain of files, heart raw but unwilling to break. Sarah whispered to the silence, this isn't about them anymore. This is about me. For the first time, she realized the battle was not against their voices, but against the part of herself that believed them. Her reflection in the darkened window stared back, tired yet fierce, as thunder rolled faintly outside. The storm finally broke, leaving the city drenched but quiet as Sarah walked out of the office under the streetlights. Her steps were slow, heavy, but her spirit was restless, refusing to sink. Every doubt still clawed at her, yet she carried something new, anger forged into fragile strength. James caught up with her on the sidewalk, his tone sardonic, but edged with rare sincerity. If you survive this, you'll stop being invisible. Sarah looked at him, eyes tired yet burning, and said, I'm not surviving, I'm choosing. The words surprised even her, ringing with a conviction that cut through the damp night air. For the first time, she wasn't moving in shadows. She was moving toward a choice that would define her. The office was alive with chatter, but for Sarah, every sound cut like static. Piles of reports consumed her desk, their weight symbolic of the judgment pressing down on her. She stared at the endless rows of data, her breath uneven, her chest tightening with the familiar ache of doubt. Memories surfaced of her childhood nights, hiding homework she was proud of, too afraid of ridicule. Now she sat at 32, still hiding brilliance behind trembling hands. James walked past, his sharp tones slicing the silence. "They're betting on you breaking." His words were cruel, but his eyes flickered with a warning. "Don't collapse." Sarah closed her eyes, steadying herself. She whispered, "Then let them lose their bet." The words surprised her, shaky but lined with fire. The storm within her raged, but this time she refused to drown. The day dragged like chains, every new task heavier than the last. Colleagues glanced at her, some smirking, others dismissive, their silent verdicts harsher than words. Sarah's fingers shook on the keyboard, but she refused to stop. The manager loomed nearby, his sneer barely hidden, as if already savoring her failure. James appeared again, leaning against her desk, voice steady but brutal. "You're afraid of failing, but you're more afraid of being seen. Decide which kills you faster." Sarah's chest tightened at his words, anger clashing with truth. She thought of her years blending into shadows, shrinking from every spotlight, and how it had suffocated her soul. For the first time, her reply carried defiance. "I'd rather fail than vanish." The sentence anchored her like stone, and the whispers around her faded into background noise. Hours slipped into night, the office emptying until only Sarah remained under the harsh hum of ceiling lights. The weight of silence pressed on her, but in it, she found space to hear her own voice. Her body ached, her eyes burned from strain, yet her spirit clung stubbornly to survival. She thought of the countless times she had let fear choke her words, the countless chances lost. The reflection in the dark window stared back, a reminder of who she had been and who she could become. "No more silence," she whispered, her own voice startling in the emptiness. For the first time, she didn't need an audience, she needed herself. The storm outside was gone, but inside her a storm had just begun to rise, promising not destruction, but rebirth. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight, but Sarah's body felt heavier than stone. Walking into the office, she braced herself for the sneers. The manager greeted her with false cheer, his voice dripping with condescension as he asked, "Still standing?" Colleagues chuckled under their breath, feeding the theater of humiliation. Sarah's heart stung, her instinct urging her to shrink, to nod, to vanish. But James' voice echoed in memory, sharp and unrelenting. "Stop waiting." She forced her chin up, voice unsteady yet defiant. "I'm not standing, I'm moving forward." The laughter faltered, surprise flashing across faces that expected surrender. Even the manager's smirk cracked. Sarah's words weren't loud, but they were undeniable, and for the first time the power in her silence shifted into power in her defiance. By evening, exhaustion weighed heavily, but Sarah's spirit pulsed with something fierce. She had been tested, humiliated, and pushed toward collapse, yet she was still here. James approached her desk, sarcasm ready on his lips, but when he spoke, it was softer than she expected. "You didn't break." Sarah looked up, her eyes raw but steady, and said, "I'm not breakable anymore." For a moment, James said nothing, his smirk fading into something like respect. The office lights buzzed above them, harsh and unkind, but Sarah no longer shrank from their glare. She thought of her journey, of the countless times she had swallowed her truth, and how tonight, for the first time, she felt her voice belong. The storm had begun inside her, and she would no longer silence it. The manager's voice cut like steel, handing Sarah a deadline meant to crush her spirit. Files stacked higher than she had ever seen, each one a weapon forged in mockery. Colleagues whispered, betting on her collapse, their laughter filling the air like daggers. Sarah's breath faltered, her chest tight, fingers trembling as she whispered, "Maybe they're right." James' voice broke through the noise, blunt and sharp. "Or maybe you finally fight." His words stung, but deep within, a spark tried to resist the weight dragging her under. The night stretched endlessly as Sarah buried herself in work. Her shoulders ached, eyes burning, each page another nail pressing into her spirit. Fear whispered, "You can't do this," a cruel refrain she had known since childhood. She slammed her palm against the desk, voice trembling but defiant. "I won't vanish." The office was empty, silence thick, but her words felt like thunder in her own chest. Exhaustion pulled her down, yet fire held her upright. By dawn, Sarah was still at her desk, eyes hollow but hands relentless. Every file completed felt like pulling herself from quicksand. Her heart screamed to stop, yet her will pushed harder. James entered, coffee in hand, raising an eyebrow. "Still alive?" he asked, sarcasm sharp but edged with respect. Sarah looked at him, voice hoarse yet steady. "Alive and fighting." The manager entered, sneer curling as he inspected her progress. "Still pretending you belong," he taunted. Sarah's hands shook, but her eyes lifted, fire burning behind the exhaustion. "I'm not pretending," she whispered, voice thin yet resolute. For the first time, the sneer faltered. That night, Sarah sat alone in the office, exhaustion pulling her down, tears streaking her face. She thought of quitting, of leaving the war unfinished. But her reflection in the dark window stared back, weary yet unbroken. She whispered, "I can't go back, not anymore." Her choice was clear, painful but unshakable. The office felt colder than ever, whispers biting sharper than knives. Sarah stacked her completed reports, each page proof she had survived the impossible. The manager's smirk widened as he leaned close, voice low and venomous. "Do you really think this was about your work?" Confusion tore through her, pulse racing, words caught in her throat. He leaned back, laughing bitterly. "You were never meant to succeed. This was a test to remind you of your place." The truth shattered her breath, betrayal crushing deeper than exhaustion. James, watching from the corner, stiffened, jaw tight as his eyes flicked between them. For years, Sarah had believed her silence protected her. Now she saw it had caged her, handed power to those who thrived on her doubt. Anger burned through the pain, fierce and raw. She whispered, voice trembling yet cutting, "You don't decide my place anymore." The revelation echoed inside Sarah like thunder. Every humiliation, every impossible task had not been misfortune, it had been designed. Her world spun as betrayal wrapped tight around her lungs. She remembered her mother's quiet doubts, the neighbors' whispers, every person who told her she didn't belong. They had all merged into this moment, weaponized against her. James stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. "Now you know. What are you going to do with it?" His challenge ripped through her despair, forcing her to look inward. Fear clawed at her ribs, but defiance burned brighter. She whispered, "I'll do more than they expect. I'll outlive their judgment." Her words felt like a blade, cutting through the fog. The room seemed smaller, air too heavy to breathe, as Sarah replayed every moment of dismissal, every quiet cruelty. She realized this was never about her work, it was about control, keeping her invisible. A laugh bubbled from her lips, bitter yet freeing, startling even herself. James raised a brow but said nothing, watching her with cautious interest. "All this time," she said, her voice steadying, "I thought failure was my greatest fear. But it was never failure. It was letting them silence me." Her words filled the space, trembling yet fierce. The manager scoffed, but his eyes flickered, a sign of unease. Sarah stood straighter, spine no longer bent beneath their weight. For years, Sarah had begged silently for approval, chasing crumbs of validation. Now, standing in the wreckage of betrayal, she realized she no longer needed it. The manager's face twisted with disdain, but Sarah felt no smaller. James smirked faintly, seeing the shift within her. "You'll regret this," the manager hissed. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest smile, eyes steady as steel. "No," she replied softly, "I'll remember this as the day I stopped being yours." The air vibrated with her words, quiet but unshakable. The storm within her no longer sought shelter, it demanded sky. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. For once it was not Sarah shrinking. It was the room itself retreating from the weight of her choice. Every year of doubt, every swallowed word, had built to this moment. She was no longer invisible. James stepped forward, his sarcasm gone, replaced with quiet respect. "Then it begins," he said simply. Sarah looked past him, past the manager, past the office itself. She whispered, steady and unafraid, "Yes, it begins." Her words were not a declaration of war, but of rebirth, forged in betrayal, sharpened by pain. And in that moment, the shadows that had followed her all her life seemed to dissolve, leaving her standing not in fear, but in her own unshakable light. The storm returned as if summoned by her defiance, rattling the windows while the office air turned electric. Sarah stood at the center of the room, her reports complete, her spirit raw but unbroken. The manager sneered, spitting venom, "You've proven nothing but stubbornness." His voice dripped with contempt, but this time it didn't crush her, it fueled her. James leaned nearby, sharp gaze never leaving her, as though waiting for her to rise higher. Sarah's chest burned, her voice trembling yet unshakable. "Stubbornness kept me alive. Now it will set me free." For the first time, she was not answering him, she was claiming herself. Her words cracked the silence, resonating like thunder, and in that moment she was no longer the shadow in the room. She was the storm itself, no longer caged, no longer waiting for permission. The manager slammed his hand on the table, papers scattering like fallen leaves. "You think one spark makes you powerful? You are nothing without our approval." His words echoed, sharp and cruel. But Sarah did not flinch. Years of silence had built this moment, years of swallowing her voice until it burned inside her. James muttered under his breath, almost amused, "Careful, she's not the same woman you broke." The truth struck her, she wasn't. Sarah inhaled, chest steady, and answered firmly, "Your approval was my prison. I've burned the bars." Every whisper in the room died, every smirk faltered. The storm outside thundered as though it echoed her words. Her defiance, once fragile, now stood tall and unshaken. Every gaze in the office burned with shock, but Sarah no longer felt their judgment. She had lived too long beneath it. The manager's face reddened, veins sharp at his temple, as his power slipped. "You'll regret this insolence," he hissed. Sarah stepped closer, every step fueled by decades of silence breaking. Her heart thundered, but she did not hesitate. James' eyes flickered, uncharacteristically proud, as though watching a battle he'd long waited for. Sarah said clearly, "No, I'll regret if I keep bowing to you." Her voice echoed in the room, not as a plea, but as a weapon. The storm roared in harmony, wind rattling the glass, as though the world itself witnessed her defiance. The silence that followed was suffocating, every eye glued to Sarah. For once, the weight of the room pressed on the manager instead of her. He sputtered, searching for control, but her defiance had torn holes in his authority. James broke the tension, voice low but edged with satisfaction. "Looks like the shadows aren't yours anymore." Sarah turned to face the room, her fear gone, her voice steady. "I've hidden too long. Today I choose to stand where I belong." The words rippled through the office, undeniable, irreversible. The storm outside calmed slightly, as if bowing to her shift. Sarah's voice steadied, louder than the storm. "I will not disappear again." The manager faltered, stepping back as though struck. For the first time, he was the one shrinking. Sarah's chest swelled with fierce breath, her heart pounding, but she did not waver. James' eyes locked on hers, approval shining through his usual cynicism. She had chosen, and that choice was louder than every silence she had ever carried. The storm outside broke into heavy rain, cleansing and relentless, washing the city clean. Inside, Sarah stood unbroken, her defiance no longer fragile but forged in steel. The climax had arrived, not in destruction, but in transformation. The office was still, whispers replaced by silence. Sarah no longer heard judgment. She heard only her own heartbeat steady and strong. The manager avoided her gaze, his authority fractured. Colleagues who once sneered now shifted uneasily, their certainty shaken. James leaned in, voice dry but genuine. "Looks like you rewrote the rules." Sarah smiled faintly, the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. "No," she said softly, "I finally wrote mine." The words hung in the air, not angry, not desperate, simply true. The storm outside gave way to pale sunlight, painting the office in a soft glow. Sarah sat at her desk, no longer shrinking, no longer hiding. Every keystroke felt like a declaration of presence. "Oh." James leaned against the wall, watching quietly. And for once, his sarcasm was gone. He nodded faintly, respect unspoken. Sarah thought of the years wasted in silence, the chances lost, and realized they no longer chained her. She whispered to herself, "The silence is over." Outside, the city gleamed with fresh rain, every reflection sharp and alive. Sarah stepped onto the street, her lungs filling with the scent of renewal. For years, she had walked these sidewalks invisible, blending into shadows. Now, each step carried weight, each breath claimed space. James walked beside her, quieter than usual, his presence a steady anchor. "You survived," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, her lips curving into a stronger truth. "No," I began. Sarah paused by the window of a small cafe, watching strangers laugh, watching life unfold. For the first time she felt not like an outsider, but like she belonged to the world. The weight of invisibility had lifted, leaving space for light. James ordered coffee inside, giving her space, yet his presence lingered as proof she was no longer alone in her fight. She thought of the girl she once was, hiding in shadows, and whispered to herself, "You made it here." That night, Sarah stood by her apartment window, the city alive with lights. She thought of the countless moments she had been told she was nothing, the endless years she had believed it. Tonight, those chains lay broken at her feet. She whispered to the skyline, voice steady and proud, "I am here." Her reflection in the glass no longer showed a shadow, it showed a woman reborn. The silence of her past dissolved into the hum of the city, carrying her into a future she would no longer fear. The final choice had been made, not to survive, but to live.